For those of you familiar with the saying, the third time is the charm, you're probably pretty excited for Apple's third generation of Apple Silicon, the M3 Max. Why? Well, when we went from M1 to M2, that was simply a minor generational jump, a small improvement, if you will, because both of those chips are essentially the exact same. The M3, on the other hand, is a completely new chip with new technology. Now, this means there are going to be a couple of pretty major differences. For example, base model MacBooks potentially shipping with 12 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabyte SSDs as a minimum. Big differences in performance, battery life, efficiency, and some other really cool stuff. Now, I am really excited for this because, I mean, look, we've had some really amazing releases over the last few years, but this is kind of like the biggest change that Apple Silicon has had ever since it was first released in November 2020. So with that being said, let's get into all of the differences. So first of all, I mean, what is the big difference between M1 and these new M3 Max? Well, the biggest difference is the size. M1 and M2 are what's known as 5 nanometer chips. Now, without getting into too much technical detail here, you know I want to kind of keep this video short and relatively interesting. Nanometers mostly refers to the transistor density on a chip. Now, you ain't seeing this difference with the naked human eye. So if you think about a chocolate chip cookie, for example, imagine you choose the smallest chocolate chip pieces available in the grocery store, and you try to cram and bake as many of them as you can onto the cookie as physically possible. Now, imagine if you got your hands on much smaller chocolate chip pieces. As a result, you can fit a lot more of them onto the same cookie. Now, it is very similar for computer chips. We're talking about silicon now, not chocolate. In fact, take a look at this graph from TSMC, which is the manufacturer of all the Apple Silicon chips, including these new 3 nanometer chips. Now you can see we've come a really long way already. I mean, 10 years ago in 2013, for example, we were at a whopping 20 nanometers. Now, we're at just 3. Now you'll also notice that that graph is really starting to flatten out and get close to 0, which means we're getting to the point where we physically cannot get the transistor density much smaller. But that's a topic for another video. So what are the advantages to cramming all of these tiny transistors into roughly the same size piece of silicon? Well, there actually are a lot. Increased transistor density typically results in increased speed and performance, reduced power consumption, and also increased efficiency. And I'm sure you could see how these benefits would come in super helpful for a laptop that needs exceptional performance and battery life, but with low heat output. Now, the existing Apple Silicon chips already do all of these things really well, especially when compared to their previous Intel counterparts, right? But there are some minor heat issues here and there, like the M1 or M2 Max variant of the 14-inch MacBook Pro, and I've also never heard anyone complain about significant performance and battery improvements. But just before we get into more of this, a quick word from the sponsor for this section of the video. Meet UPDF, the AI-powered PDF editor built to simplify document editing. Whether you're on Mac, iOS, iPadOS, Windows, or Android, UPDF's got you covered with a single license that spans across all platforms. You can easily modify text and images in a PDF on your iPad, and it allows you to reorder, rotate, and extract pages. Need to fill forms? Well, UPDF's got your back, automatically identifying fields. And if you take your privacy seriously, you can encrypt and password protect any PDF file. UPDF Cloud allows you to access and synchronize all of your documents from all of your devices. In addition, UPDF provides a set of AI tools. You can summarize PDFs, translate to multiple languages, and it can even explain complex information and data contained in a PDF. And my favorite AI feature, AI-powered OCR. You can extract data from scanned and image-based PDF files into formats that you can easily edit. So don't miss the chance to get UPDF Pro with an exclusive 63% discount now by clicking the link in the description. Okay, so now we're aware of the new 3 nanometer technology behind the M3 Apple Silicon chips. And I'll get into the performance improvements in just a second, but first I want to talk about a super exciting rumor I've heard floating around, and that is that the base model Macs will start shipping with at least 12 gigabytes of RAM and possibly even a 512GB SSD as well. Now, to be fair, there's not that much solid evidence supporting a 512GB SSD base model, so I won't get into that too much. Although Apple did make a big change with the most recent M2 Macs, where the base model 256GB versions were only shipped with a single SSD NAND chip instead of two like they did in previous M1 versions. I'll link a video I made explaining that. Now, maybe this was a stage one or a step one for Apple to eventually streamline all Macs with the same 512GB base model storage. Who knows? In terms of RAM though, there's at least a little bit more substance to the rumors. Mark Gurman, who has a pretty solid track record with most of his leaks actually ending up being relatively accurate, let this slip a few weeks ago. These were his predicted RAM configurations for the new M3 Apple Silicon chips based on the leaked information he had access to. Now you'll notice that instead of the usual 16, 32 or 64 gigabytes of RAM that we typically have seen up until now in the MacBook Pros, it's instead in multiples of 12. For example, 36 or 48 gigabytes. Now, if you do the maths and also realize that MacBook Pro chips are essentially slightly beefed up versions of the standard MacBook Air chips, aka almost exactly the same, that means we could potentially see base model MacBooks like the 13-inch MacBook Air ship with 12 gigabytes of RAM instead of 8 gigabytes. Now, if this is true, and I really hope it is, I think it's a pretty major difference. Sure, I mean, most people buying base model Macs are totally fine with 8 gigabytes, and I know that that's a really controversial opinion, but there are also a lot of situations where having just a few more gigabytes of RAM comes in really helpful. And currently the only way to get that extra headroom in terms of RAM is by forking out hundreds of dollars for the 16 gigabyte RAM upgrade. And if you're a student living on 2-minute noodles or located in a country where Apple products are really expensive, that extra cost is just not realistic. And I've mentioned this before in other tests and videos on this channel, but adding more RAM to Apple Silicon, especially what we've seen in the M2 chips, essentially unlocks a significant amount of additional performance because of the way unified memory works on these chips. You're not just adding 4 gigabytes to web browser tabs or multitasking, you're making that memory available to the CPU and the GPU as well. So now that I've covered the effect more RAM brings to performance, what about the general performance improvements we can expect from M3 over M2? Well, it's expected that there's around a 15 to 20% performance gain, but remember that due in part to the increased transistor density of 3 nanometers, we can fit more cores on the same chip. Now, looking at the M3 Pro chip, for example, Mark Gurman expects the base model to ship with 12 CPU cores, up from 10 on the M2, and 18 GPU cores, up from 16 on the M2. And if we're already getting an extra 20% more performance out of each individual core, and then we add several more cores on top of that, I'm pretty excited to see how this is going to impact real-life workflows. And don't forget about the release of the new A17 Pro chip for the iPhone 15 Pro and Max models. It's the first iteration of 3 nanometer technology, and Apple also decided to add hardware ray tracing, which is going to give a huge boost to some 3D applications like virtual reality and gaming. And I'm 95% confident this is going to be on Mac Apple Silicon too, because it's essentially the same architecture. More about the A17 Pro and hardware ray tracing in this video if you're interested. Also, by the looks of it, the entry-level Macs won't see as big a jump in performance. I mean, you get pretty much the exact same number of cores. But oh boy, just look at the M3 Max and M3 Ultra. 64 GPU cores in the base model M3 Ultra. I mean, I cannot wait to see that in action. And don't forget that the other major improvement that 3 nanometer technology brings is efficiency. Now, it's expected to use up to 30% less power to complete the same tasks as previous 5 nanometer chips. And a byproduct of this is also less heat, which is great for fanless designs like the MacBook Air or small chassis like the 14-inch M1 or M2 Max chip MacBook Pros. The question now is, should you upgrade? Well, if you currently have Apple Silicon, no, please do not upgrade just for the sake of a bit more performance and battery life. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the current Apple Silicon Mac you have. You know, it's gonna be perfectly fine for probably at least another 5 years. The only exception to this is if you have an Intel Mac. If you do, throw it in the fire immediately. And the reason I say this is, even though M3 is going to be quite a bit better than M2 and quite a bit better than M1, most people just won't notice the differences. That being said, if you've just dropped your MacBook and the repair costs almost as much as just buying a new one, typical Apple.
We love our users.
Or you have an original M1 MacBook, but maybe your needs have changed and you need something with more power now, for example, we should be getting these new entry-level M3 Macs in October, and the more powerful MacBook Pros and possibly Studios early next year. But yeah, apart from that, super excited to see what this new 3nm technology will bring. I haven't really been this excited for a new Mac launch probably for the last 2 years or so. So as soon as they're released, I'm gonna buy a couple. I'm gonna do my usual smorgasbord or suite of videos on this channel, so stay tuned for that, and I'll catch you in the next one.